Mind my speaking? Okay, can my timer be restarted, please? Okay, great. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. 3 extraneous rebuttals before I get into our constructive case. Firstly, on the counterfactual panel, this House supports motion, which essentially means we have no fiat on gov, therefore op really can't come up with a counterfactual. But I'm glad they did because it's ridiculously stupid and I'm going to have a gala time tearing it apart. They tell you that you're going to go ahead and build more law schools on their side of the house, except how does this change the incentives of anybody that's going to these law schools in the first place? Why won't these people want to go ahead and enter corporate law and make bank? Note that the problem in the status quo isn't that there exists a paucity of lawyers. I promise you there are several that are unemployed right now. However, the problem is there exists a paucity of individuals that are willing to slug it out for 15 years in litigation before they get half the recognition and wealth that their corporate counterparts do, right? They don't go ahead and solve the actual problem that exists. Therefore, it's a problem solution mismatch. All benefits that flow from their counterfactual, therefore, do not stand on opening opposition. Secondly, they tell you judges have an incentive to be remembered. I agree with opening opposition to the extent that I agree that there exists an underlying assumption that judges themselves can have personal incentives behind how they go ahead and write judgments. I don't know why they agreed to concede to that, because the minute they say that Keshavananda Bharati case may you only had the dissent because judge wanted to be remembered, you're going ahead and agreeing to the entirety of government, which goes ahead and says that judges have underlying personal incentives when they go ahead and write out particular judgments, right? Except I'm going to give you actual structural reasons for why this is likely to be the other way around. Note that currently, in the context of India, with the rising right-wing rhetoric, as well as the rhetoric of otherization, i.e., anybody that speaks against what the Hindu majority says is asked to leave to Pakistan, we think more judges have an incentive to not go ahead and lose their jobs. Well, technically, judges can't lose their jobs, but you know what the BJP government has been doing. You skip over the judges that are likely to be more liberal and give the other judges CJ ships. Additionally, you also go ahead and transfer judges around based on benches if you disagree with that particular kind of verdict. Regardless of whether you're a filmmaker or a politician, the Indian right wing will absolutely drag you through the mud. We think there exists a greater incentive for judges to act in favor of the government than against. Third and final rebuttal is the right to privacy, which I think is hilarious. Okay, they tell you it's so important to note that court judgments are in fact a matter of public record in India, and then they tell you that it becomes too easy to go ahead and rely on precedents, and you have too many precedents, and that's why it's a bad thing. Unsure as to why that is even true. We're a common law country, and we definitely have rule of law within this nation. Why is doing away with precedents likely to be a bad thing? If we live on their side of the house, the Indian judicial system is essentially crippled, because now you have to hear every case from the scratch, including their facts, right? Also note that you can still technically go ahead and leave out names which are a part of the AI. Not sure why every single defendant and criminal can't be called Ram and Sita in the AI, and why we specifically need their names and details for each and every case, thereby going ahead and protecting their privacy even on our side of the house. What then is our constructive case? What does this increased use of AI look like? We think in the initial stages it looks like going ahead and verifying handwriting samples by AI to avoid human error, or going ahead and checking photographs to detect any potential edits. This also in the longer run looks like feeding precedents to AI that can match cases at hand with the others that have similar facts. What then is our constructive case? 3 arguments we present to you. Firstly, on how we create better legal mechanisms. What do we mean by this? Opening government tells you that judges are biased, and opening opposition tells you that technology itself is biased. 1 second, I'm getting the Zoom notification that my internet connection is unstable. I'm not sure if I can still be heard. I'm going to turn off my camera and see if this gets any better. Can somebody confirm that I'm being heard? Hello? Okay. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
we can hear you.
I'm really sorry about that. My internet is just not backing me up today. I'll just take like 10 seconds extra. All right. 3 arguments we present to you then as a part of our constructives. Opening government tells you that judges are biased. Opening opposition tells you that technology is biased. Great, we're all in agreement. Nobody can solve the bias problem. What is the actual problem that we can go ahead and solve? First argument, we create better legal mechanisms. 3 layers of analysis. 1, we create a legal system that is more efficient. The fatal flaw of the Indian judicial system right now isn't that it is too biased. We think that's a problem that exists within all judicial systems, and India is doing relatively better compared to some of the countries in the West. So I'm not really complaining about that. But we think the primary problem is the 300-year backlog that exists on our Supreme Courts right now, right? And this is just the topmost court within the country, not to mention district courts and high courts, which get a significantly higher traffic of cases in the first place. This increases the burden upon the courts themselves and essentially renders them useless. If my phone gets stolen today, there is no judicial respite I can get to this till a minimum of 5 years go ahead and lapse between then and now. We think this decreases the faith in the system to an incredibly high level, thereby creating the problem that opening opposition was talking about, wherein going to courts is a taboo in the first place, because courts are essentially seen as places that go ahead and harbor and fester corruption and bureaucracy within their walls, right? Also note that specifically because of this delay, those that need the court the most are the ones that are most unlikely to go, right? Because we think it is the individuals that are the poorest and most disenfranchised in society that simply do not have a decade's worth of free time on their hands to show up for any court listing that comes up within their own case, right? We think these individuals are more likely to let these transgressions then pass, which we think is really, really bad for a society that we want to live in and makes our systems inefficient. But also the Indian courts are infamous for going ahead and turning and overturning their own precedents. It took us 16 cases to come to our final decision on whether or not we like capital punishment as a country, and we think that's bizarre, right? There is no consistency in the way one high court gives a judgment versus the other, even if the facts of the case are likely to be identical. We think having preliminary case analysis done by an AI significantly helps reduce such inconsistencies and makes our courts one that is more reliable by the people. Secondly, on the idea of fairness, we think that these AIs are not reliant on externalities like reputations of lawyers or rhetoric of the lawyers or reputation of the defendants themselves. This looks like people that dissent against the government, like Umar Khalid, not getting bail for 3 years within this country despite being in jail, and there simply not being enough evidence because the judges are too terrified about what's going to happen if they let out a dissentee under their own watch, right? We think an AI is unlikely to go ahead and have similar biases. Therefore, a judge, once they see that an AI too would have exonerated this individual, is more likely to go ahead and exonerate this person. CO, your POI. Okay.
All right. So if AIs are also biased on your side, wouldn't people not have an incentive to reform the system if, as OG says, that these things are gonna be, seen as very objective?
This is perfect because my third argument is transparency. OG already says this, which is why I had it for last, but CO clearly didn't hear them. So look, what we say is that it's very easy to go ahead and backtrack how an algorithm thinks, right? Unlike what judges do, i.e. write down in the Orbiter section portion of their judgment, you can't really go ahead and map out a judge's brain and see exactly where the racism turned on. Unlike that, you can actually go ahead and backtrack AI algorithms to see why specific judgments were made the way that they were. We think this makes the process incredibly more transparent and therefore makes it so much easier on our side of the house to actually call out problematic patterns. We think there are dedicated think tanks that already would be willing to do this within countries like India. Our second argument is we create better legal impact systems like deterrence and retribution. By deterrence, we mean if your court cases are likely to be done away with faster, you create greater deterrence amongst criminals themselves because they don't think like, oh, I'll just go ahead and commit a crime maybe 20 years later before I die, I might get convicted. That decreases on our side of the house, therefore net crime rate goes down. But secondly, on retribution, we think victims are just able to get justice significantly faster on our side of the house, or at least a glimpse of justice before the court makes them wait around for like 30 odd years. We think that already makes the justice system so much better on our side of the house. We give you efficiency, we give you fairness, we give you transparency, deterrence, and retribution. Incredibly proud to propose.
I thank closing government for the case. I would like to call closing opposition to bring their case.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Hi, yes, we can hear you and see you.
Okay, one sec, I'll set up my timer. While I do that, if you have POIs, please put them in the chat. Yeah, I don't take POIs verbally because it distracts me, but I'll make sure to take one before 6, so don't worry. Okay. Concession that I make with CG is that this is a support motion, so Gov cannot fiat how to enact this policy well. They need to defend AI involvement that exists as of now. So that means that they cannot just prop and say that they will import AIs from the United States. It's just really weird, right? But I think also that means that opening HUFS out, as CG says, and I'm glad that we have agreement with them. And that also means that opposition bench as an entirety don't have the burden to prove why we're able to change these things through opposition fiat that also talked about. But insofar as if we can tell you that the CJS in India is likely to get far worse on Gov, then that is already enough for us to win this debate. So OG gives us a shopping list of problems of the status quo. I'm not really unsure how you can solve that through the AI's mechanism, other than just saying that AI is, well, objective for some reason, which I'm going to show you why AIs are likely to have same biases, which I think O just largely asserts, and I'm going to structurally show you why that's the case. And therefore, the delta of this debate is not just the idea of whether or not the CJS is fair, but it's more about the ability for the society to correct affect these things. And so I think in that regards, we're already like biting a greater bullet than opening opposition as to why we think that AIs are in itself pernicious, and therefore we already come over them if we're able to prove that in our speech. Okay, so let's firstly deal with CG's extension, which is, I think, firstly, this idea of efficiency, right? Number one, I think this is similar to OG when they talk about like, hey, you don't have to spend huge amount of money, so I'm really unsure about the exclusivity of this extension coming from CG. But secondly, if I were to flip this analysis, I can literally tell you that because it's efficient, because it's like cost efficient, time efficient, and all that, that literally means that people have less incentive and impetus to reform the system because it's short, it's relatively less discussion, there's less of a check and balance, there's less of discourse. That literally means that there's lack of ability for the society to infiltrate into the system and see where it's skewed and therefore have the ability to fix the system. So there is the like all the rebuttals, like remaining rebuttals will be included in my extension. So which is going to be very simple. I'm going to show you number one, that AIs are really biased and not as fair as Gov wants you to believe in, and secondly, why that means that there's a huge smokescreen effect in on government bench. Firstly, why we think that AIs are in itself discriminatory, because I think that the faulty premise of OG is that AIs are super fair and objective, which I don't think is true. Firstly, big data and machine learning base their decision-making process on things like algorithm, which is inaccessible because machine languages are not convertible to human language. This is very crucial because computer language are oftentimes not interpretable for vast majority of individuals. OG just asserts that it's understandable, which is echoed by CG. Like, how many of us can actually use things like Java and Python? How many of us can actually use AIs? I really don't think that they can say that these things are relatively easier to understand and interpret. I don't really think that's the case. To the extent to which this is true, I'd argue that the benefit that CG wants to claim is actually better co-opted on our side because we can trace the verdict and the ways in which these decisions have been necessarily concluded because of the fact that it's written in human language, it's written in Indian language. So that literally means that it's easier for individuals to understand, right? But so therefore, OG says that, hey, but it's still going to be inaccessible, which I think is largely uncomparative. It's like at least comparatively better. But then CG says that, hey, you don't know where racism has entered into this particular verdict or decision-making process if it's just based on human language. I don't know why this is an important thing, right? Because we don't have to exactly discern which point has the racism entered in order to reform the system, insofar as we can still prove the idea, or we can still see that the CJS is largely skewed against Muslim minority. That presumably means that there's already an incentive that is symmetric on our side to be able to reform the system and solve the problem of racism. But secondly, I would also suggest that the idea of AIs and the way in which they make decision is based on literally the accumulation of data, like 30 years history that CG tells you. That literally means that AIs don't take into consideration the direction that Indian society wants to progress, but it's rather likely to largely hinge their decision on the precedents. So if minorities have been historically disenfranchised in CJS system, precisely because AIs are going to take these historical legal precedents into the consideration and make decisions based on that, is exactly the reason why a lot of these things are going to be a lot of racism is going to be perpetuated on their side. So it's comparatively better for present judges to issue the verdict as opposed to issuing verdict based on legal precedents, which are largely an accumulation of discriminatory verdicts that all Gulf bench so talked about. So intuitively speaking, disparity based on ethnicity, caste systems, or class or gender was larger in the past. Also, if that's the basis of the verdict on Gov, I really don't think that they are able to solve any of the discrimination problem that they talked about. But the second thing that I would argue is that the motion says that AI is not going to be replacing the entire human on their side anyways, as OG tells you, which literally means that human involvement and their discriminatory practices would exist on their world anyways. So if AI says that this perpetrator has committed a manslaughter and therefore deserves between 10 to 20 years of prison incarceration, that means that if the judges are truly biased, that means that this judge is still likely to impose 20 maximum extent and the fullest extent of punishment and incarceration to these individuals. So that literally means that all the harm coming from OG and CG with regards to how CJS is skewed is symmetric on both worlds. What then is asymmetric? I think that on our side, the point that on their side actually, there's a huge smokescreen effect that exists that likely people are going to see this as incredible system, which means that there's no impetus to reform. So if OG's softline case is true, that government as of now have an incentive to change, these things stop on their side when the point in which they see CJS as fair, right? So I think this is largely harmful, but more importantly, because it's AI and people see this as largely far-fetched and distant, is a point where I think that humans are likely to see themselves as powerless and hence no incentive to hold AI CJS as accountable. On opposition, what happens? So even if on the opposition side you have discriminatory practices, you still have like all these racism that exist, it's comparatively fine, precisely because on our side, because it's human judges, they speak in your language, you see a lot of commonality, is a point where on the ground activism are more incentivized to call these individuals out, and there are impetus to reform the system, as opposed to on government side when there's a huge smokescreen effect in which there's a facade of equality, and that also shuts down any claims that the CJS needs to change on their side. Even if it is fair, which I think is the best case scenario of golf, people won't see in that way, which I think is quite harmful, because the perception that AI is inaccessible and therefore there's distrust among the minority group means that on their side of the house, a lot of these ethnic conflicts are likely to inflare, precisely because if they see, for example, like if the point in which they see AIs as like imposing certain verdicts on certain individuals, likely people are still going to see this as unfair, and if that's the historic perception against Indian CJS, that perception would exist on both worlds anyways. To the extent to which if that is true, I think that that's where things like ethno-populism, things like right-wing nationalism is likely to even inflare on their side, precisely because AI, not necessarily human beings. For these reasons, very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I would like to call closing government to conclude the case from side government.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the problem with the bench in this debate is quite clear that they tell us why AI won't be perfect, except they don't respond why the world today is perfect. Right? I think the framing that you get from member of Gov in terms of how the world is really bad right now, and any delta that we can create through AI is quite meaningful to specifically victims. We should win this debate. I'll go clash by clash, but my speech should be centered around rebuttals in weighing will be integrated. Firstly, on our computers enough, because that's a stupid claim that came on the top half, right? Oh, asserts yes, computers are enough. You don't need AI. OG counter asserts that no, you need to weigh data in spreadsheet. Cannot do that. None of this is analysis. So here's analysis for why AI is needed and not computers are not enough. One, because input is a natural language, which is especially true for a field that heavily relies on the past. It also you probably need things like computer vision to actually read documents and other hard copies, which means computers aren't enough. Secondly, you need to make judgments and not just perform functions that existing data. This means it needs to show some level of intelligence in that it needs to use like logic and reasoning, but also it needs to understand what that logic and reasoning is and what fair and unfair are. Doing that can only be done through AI, which means all the benefits of efficiency that OG talks about uniquely exist in CG's world because we proved to you why computers are not enough, something that opening opposition challenge. Second, on the clash of what creates more fair verdicts. Why do we get more fair verdicts is pointing directly to CO. One, because there's less bias in creation. Why this is true specifically about India. Note that my first speaker already talked to you about how the legal system is generally like catering towards privileged individuals simply because of how the government sectors are set up, because of the large level of corruptions that exist. AI is created more by individuals in STEM. Why is that better? Two reasons. One, because STEM field is generally not homogenized by certain cultural groups because there doesn't exist any cultural value to STEM the same way it does exist for government institutions, which means you have a good representation of like both Hindu minorities, but also like other religious minorities that exist. Secondly, the process of joining STEM fields, for example, IITs has far more affirmative action than state does, which means 50% of individuals, 50% of seats are directly reserved, which means individuals are likely to get. Three, the individuals who are working on AI, whether they're Indian, American, or like from some other country, are far more likely to working within diverse workspace because STEM corporations have better understood the value of like diversity. But secondly, also understanding of things like coding is far more democratized through like online platforms like YouTube because of the corporate incentives that exist rather than laws. Which means the debate is about are the creators of this AI more biased or judges more biased, we're winning that just because the creators of AI are less biased, which means the AI will therefore be less biased. Second, the ability of control to fix, and this is really important, right? You can actually redesign AIs, yeah, but you can't do that with human beings, right? Why is that specifically true for like humans and then India? Know that like humans don't correct themselves because they're largely firm in their beliefs. This is because there is often social cost attached to changing your beliefs, which means if you're a justice who has like in the past spoken about how you personally feel like that the Muslim minority is a problem for the country, you going ahead and voting against that in a court is going to be bad for you. Or even for example, smaller judges who pride themselves themselves over the kind of punishments they give. Giving shorter punishments is going to be bad for them. But specifically in India, and this is really important, right? In India, state actors are often glorified to the extent where criticizing them is often seen as criticizing of the concept of India in general, which means you can't go ahead and call out judges. Which means this argument that you get in every debate about, oh, you can't call out AI, but you can't call out judges, specifically does not exist in India, which means even that weird argument you get from CEO falls. Thirdly, and this is really important, is simply because like AI can be fixed simply by viewing input and output. And this leads to the CEO's argument of, oh, you don't know Java, so you don't know AI, right? I don't know Java, but I can talk, like, recognize when Facebook is advertising to me based on searches I did in the past. Or no, many people didn't know Java, yet we found out what happened in Cambridge Analytica. But beyond examples, there are three reasons why that argument doesn't work. One, because you can see input and output, and this is the only argument you need to know, right? You don't need to see how the NLP is like processing the data. You don't need to know how the AI is processing the data. You can see what the situations of the crime were. You can see the punishment vetted out, and you can see the trends in such punishments and decide whether the AI is acting fairly. If it's not acting fairly, you can actually correct it, something you can't do for people because you can't recode human beings. Secondly, large organizations that exist, even right now, we don't think it's like the normal individuals who even understand or care about like the justice system. We think it's often done by like Amnesty or other organizations, for example, college students who are doing research projects or and so forth, which means if those people do get Java, if those people can see the data set, which means probably government should allow some amount of oversight, which means they can call out the data structures, so on and so forth. That is something that we uniquely get. The last argument we get from CEO on like why fairness won't exist is because we go on precedents, and this is bad because like the past has been historically bad. Two responses to this: one, because the past has been bad to individuals based on interpretations of correct first principles, which is to say no state, and like this is about India, so forget no state. No, our constitution is very clearly pro secularism and pro individual rights and like pro minorities also, which means every time there has been an incident in the past is based on subjective understanding of this like first principles. AI will only understand those first principles and correct it its own way and transpose them to use them more correctly, and it won't make those mistakes or won't actively go ahead and try to make those mistakes. Secondly, you can code it to like fix those outcomes, and this is like a weird debate to have. Since you have so much control, you can make it optimize outcomes to ensure that the social justice you want more closely represents the values you as a country or your constitution or your preamble stands for. You think that means at all points in times AI is far more beneficial? Where do you have more buy-in? OG says technology is perceived as something that is objective. Opening opposition says technology is no relatable. Both statements are true, but neither team has any efforts in weighing this. Why do we win this clash then on terms of buy-in? One, because of what Shruti tells you. The fact that the state is polarized. The fact that in our country we had the entire left hating on the Supreme Court when they banned triple talaq, then suddenly loving it when they go ahead and made women allowed to enter Sabrimala, to enter Sabrimala, then again hating it when the Ram Mandir verdict was given out, means that currently we live in a world where people just aren't buying into the idea of the state in India simply because of polarization. Even if it is true in general, like technology may not be trusted in India, the court is not trusted by any side that loses the verdict, which means we uniquely fix that on our side. Before I like get into some more opening up.
Right, considering that the state is still likely to be majoritarian and go ahead and dictate the algorithms, why do STEM progressive engineers are likely to go ahead and undercut the state's incentive of pushing majoritarian policies on minorities?
Because the state will approach them to code, they will say, okay, we'll code, then they'll code something that's unbiased. Okay, moving on. Secondly, why do we still have more buy-in? One, because AI does not have any identity. This responds to opening opposition claims, and that we agree it's not relatable. The problem then we say that relatability is bad enough itself because there exists animus between individuals. There exists a perception of this may be flawed. If there is AI, at least people can move on and accept the verdict. This is specifically true when majorities lose the verdict. Thirdly, it means media can't like polarize this verdict, and which means that in our world we're likely to have better victim closure, so on and so forth. What is the impact of this one? We have more people getting justice, showing up, and so on and so forth. Something that member talked about, which already exists within the debate. Lastly, is efficiency of fair trade-off, and this is really important because OG and O both say that, oh, we want efficiency, and the other team says no, we want fair verdicts, but no team necessarily weighs this for you, right? Let's assume the verdicts that AI makes are slightly unfair but much faster. Why is that still preferable? 4 reasons. One, because if you delay justice, there is no justice since evidence is impossible to collect. Secondly, witnesses are often dispersed and unreliable. 3, the value to victims in terms of the retribution you can give them is reduced over time. Fourthly, there is this increase of friction for victims, which means they never really show up when they know that, look, I won't get justice for 5 years. Why do I even bother going? Which means even if we take opposition's best case, where AI is slightly more unfair, the fact that it is faster in and of itself ought to be weighed higher. We think on these grounds we like clearly win on all clashes. Proud to win.
I thank closing government for the case. I would like to call closing opposition to conclude the case from side closing opposition and op bench.
Yeah. Okay. PLIs verbally, please. Preferably like 5 minutes, maybe. Maybe at the 5th minute. Okay, let's start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm just gonna go over every argument that our teams, the different teams said to actually see what exactly is our teams not agreeing about, to actually define why CO proves the most important mechanism in this debate. So first of all, like we have a list of like arguments and opening government. We hear arguments like how these are more, if it's more effective, it's more accessible. I will talk about that later on. But I think a big part of opening government is the idea that this trust system, that idea that AI, people would intrinsically have more trust towards AI. Opposition, on the other hand, says, oh, people will have trust in the AI. They kind of assert this. I don't think that anyone in opening can win this debate because of that. We have a very weird argument about privacy. I think CG does well. Shop explain as to why it's probably not the biggest delta in this debate. I think public recordings are a very fact that probably speaking, that's not going to change anything outside. How does CG enter this debate? He talks about, like, I think the idea of time efficiency is also an OG thing, so I'll deal with that together. Secondly, the idea of fairness and rhetoric not being excluded. I think the thing we'll probably I'm going to talk about that later on as well. But the most important thing I think in this debate that happened was their last argument about how backtracking is possible. And notice, Judge, they spent like literally 20 seconds to explain as to why somehow backtracking is possible. I think that a conception that all three other teams have in this debate is that AIs provide an algebraic formula in which people can see the ratio of emphasis in which, like, which parts, like, is it like the fact that they were born in a poor background, was it the fact that they're racial? These are things in which aren't considered at all. These are things in which open government, including government, things that the AI works based upon. I don't think this is the way in which AI works upon, and I'm going to tell you as to why the language of the AI is incommensurable and cannot be translated to the black box nature of AI. It's something where C already told you. Nobody wants to hear from like CG is like, but like people can learn Java, or I have some intuition pump as people can have an intuition pump as well. I'll tell you how AIs actually work, right? So if there's a dog and there's a cat image, with AIs, how they function is once a person starts the AI, they see the caption under the image and they're like, oh, dog, 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 as a cat, and they start classifying in different things. This is done through an empirical process called machine learning, because human beings simply can't have the capacity to go through millions of photos, right? The outcome here is not that the AI can explain to a human being, look, I chose this image as like a dog because it has cute ears and it's very active or whatever. No, that's not how it happens. It just simply does things based off immense amounts of data. So let's just say is it likely that it is more true. It does not mean it is perfect. It does not mean that people can trust it. It does not mean that people can understand it. A person who designed the AI, even a person who created a damn AI machine, cannot explain as to why the reasonings behind why the AI decided to pick the cat image instead of the dog image. That's a real comparative in this debate. That's why you can never cross the boundary of between the AI and the human being. You can't explain the rationality. You can't explain the ethical values in which these are described. It simply reflects the past. That's again also as to why CG's observed response like, we can tweak A, we can extract principles from it, but B, we can also tweak the outcomes, is simply false. It is not an algebra in which you can increase the amount of social justice-ness, or neither is it a thing in which you can create a formula in which people can understand and therefore improve upon. That's the reason why I told you on our member speech is probably going to be reflective of the past, and that's the reason why we're going to win this debate upon. But before that, sure, opening.
For all the reasons of trust, government has an incentive to make AI publicize simplified version of verdict, which means people can understand and hold accountable.
You can't understand the logic of AI. Even the creators cannot explain how the AI works. It's because it's a different process which is empirically based upon. If I just simply, it's like you're shoving in a humongous amount of data and you get all, like it's like you shove. It's not like human beings. It's not like human beings in which they can have some rationale. AI simply empirically provided using quantity, not quality, and that's the reason why is it impossible. I already told you as to why like even the creators can't explain it. If even the creators can't do it, the probably government, and especially in the status quo right now, probably can't do it anyways. That's probably why opening government is out of debate. But going back, so I explained to you the concept of incommensurability and black boxing, and why it's probably impossible for AIs to explain to human beings, and basically you're leaving the hands of like the CGS system to a bunch of aliens. So number one, I want to talk about how basically this is going to be likely to, even if the best incentive structure in which governments are more likely to care for minorities, what is inherently likely to be that case. Number one, even if individuals have the motive, have some level of benevolence, does not mean that people who are included there will be benevolent. Opening like closing government's argument was basically but there are a lot of people who are from Western backgrounds or can't learn these things and therefore can likely to be more democratic. It's still in a comparative sense, and even in like the most advanced country in the world, people are oftentimes excluded from engineering, they're excluded from computer science, and that's probably the reason why even if you're going to literally import a criminal justice system from the United States but to India, I think it's very likely that in which a lot of people will systematically excluded, especially people of color. And if you're applying the American standard to India, that's also a problem because there's a different racial system. system, right? So therefore, I don't think it's likely to be as reflective. Number two, it's probably not going to happen because, probably speaking, you're using an Indian system. Therefore, you want to use precedents that are based on Indian backgrounds instead of simply using it on based off of like American system. Third of all, it's absurd that a country will literally import a serious system from America. That's probably not going to be the case in which India already has tried its AI system. I don't think that's very likely. That's the reason why, probably speaking, even if it was imported, I don't think it's likely to be functional. But secondly, we told you on our member speech that the outcome is empirically based off, right? It is something which is already imbued, because it's already imbued with facts that are constructed in the past. It is imbued. So the only response we hear from CG is basically, but we can always fix, we can extract the principle from that, or we can also try to see if we can try to accommodate and twinkle around with AI. Once the AI starts, that you cannot control it, because you don't know. Again, these are things in which human beings cannot control at all. These are things in which you can decode how to classify things, but you can't tweak around like how to accommodate these things. Of course, you can say that we'll have the judges there to accommodate things as well. But probably speaking, this is going to be probably speaking. I don't think the judges, in a comparative sense, have the capabilities to do so as well. But secondarily, I think it's very likely that then in that case, you're simply going to regurgitate the past wrongdoings, but also have facade of solvency, and therefore you're likely to end up using the very outcomes that were deemed problematic and are problematic, but still end up using as a basis of your judgment. And that's the reason why it's probably going to be worse off for these people. But lastly, I want to touch upon quickly the idea of accessibility, right? This idea of like it's more accessible. I think it's probably like maybe it becomes cheaper, sure, but we already flipped this argument by saying it's probably the reason why we need to have enough incentives in order to change the system. If it becomes so cheap and accessible, people will just change the laws, or the people who will end up constituting the system will simply use this as a facade of solvency. But second of all, it's probably likely that if people perceive it to be if people don't trust the system because of all the reasons I told you, it's very unlikely that people will think that this is a good thing and therefore reduces the cost. They'll just think like, the system wants to get rid of these problems cheaply, so they're using an incomplete system to solve all these problems. This then we can therefore co-opt opening operational benefits, because all the arguments that OO talks about and the benefits of like how we reduce tensions within a country is, and even fighting against OG, is hinged upon the very assumption that people can't understand at least what it can do to human beings. It can actually talk to them. If a judge makes a bad shitty thing, a person from all the think tanks you guys talked about in CG can actually come up and approach and interview this person, or these people have to approach their superiors. We're not saying this Indian CG system is perfect. We're just saying in comparison, it's a system that is relatively likely, but not in a complete state, relatively likely to be fixed in the long run because of democratization, things like of globalization, etc. Compared to a system which is stuck in a moment in the past in which human beings have no control whatsoever, I think that's a system that we should go against. For all these reasons, go for opposition.